Welcome, traveler. Tonight the story is not told by a person. It is told by a tree, an oak, standing alone on a low hill in the English countryside. It has stood here for more than 900 years. It has watched kings pass beneath its branches, watched villages rise and change and sometimes disappear, watched centuries move by the way you might watch clouds. Tonight, under a clear sky, it remembers. Come and rest beneath its branches. Let 900 years of quiet memory carry you to sleep. I am an oak. I do not have a name in the way that people have names, though over the centuries different people have called me different things. The old tree, the hill oak, once for a while the hanging tree. Though I try not to think about that period too much, I have stood on this hill for a very long time, longer than I can count in the way that people count. Though I have learned, over the centuries, to understand how people measure time, and I know that it has been more than 900 years since I was young. I was an acorn once. This is true of all oaks, though it is strange to think about now, given how large I have become. A small thing, fallen from a parent tree that stood somewhere nearby, though that tree is long gone now, and I do not remember it directly. I remember only being small, being a sapling, the particular vulnerability of those early years, when a young tree can be eaten by deer, trampled by larger animals, or simply fail to find enough light and water to continue growing. I survived, grew, became, over decades, the kind of tree that people notice, large enough to provide real shade, sturdy enough to be useful as a landmark, a meeting place, a boundary marker. And then I kept growing, for centuries. I am very large now. My trunk is wider than several people standing with their arms outstretched, fingertip to fingertip. My branches spread further than the length of several houses. My roots extend underground in patterns that mirror my branches, reaching out into the soil in all directions, drawing up water and the particular nutrients that have allowed me to continue year after year, century after century. I do not move in the way that people and animals move. I do not travel. I have spent my entire existence on this hill, in this spot, experiencing the world as it comes to me, rather than going to experience it. But the world has come to me over 900 years, more of it than most people ever see in their much shorter lives. Tonight, I will tell you some of what I remember. My earliest clear memories are not of people. They are of seasons, the particular rhythm of growth and dormancy that defines an oak's existence, the slow swelling of buds in spring, the unfurling of leaves, the long green months of summer when sunlight is abundant and growth is steady, the turning of leaves to gold and brown in autumn, the bare months of winter when I rest, conserving what I have stored, waiting for the cycle to begin again. I have experienced this cycle more than 900 times, each one slightly different. Some springs come early, some late. Some summers are dry, testing my roots' ability to find water deep in the soil. Some winters are mild, others bring ice and snow that weighs heavily on my branches. But the basic pattern has repeated reliably for my entire existence. This rhythm is, in some sense, the foundation of everything else I remember, the steady pulse against which all the human events I witnessed took place. The first people I remember clearly were farmers. This was, by the way people count time, sometime in the 12th century, though I did not know this word, this way of organizing time, until much later, from listening to people talk. a small farm on the land near my hill, a family. I do not know how many people exactly, but enough to work the land, to tend animals, to live the kind of life that farming families lived in that period. They used my hill for grazing, sometimes, sheep, mostly, moving across the slope below me, cropping the grass. And they used me in a small way that I noticed even as a relatively young tree, as a landmark, a point of reference, the big oak on the hill, visible from a distance, helping people orient themselves as they moved across the landscape. I did not understand then what I would become to the people who lived near me over the centuries that followed. I was simply a tree, growing, existing, providing shade in summer to whoever sought it. One of my earliest specific memories, specific in the sense of involving a particular person rather than a general pattern of people coming and going, is of a shepherd, a young man, I believe, though it is sometimes difficult for me to judge human ages precisely. He tended sheep on the slopes below my hill, and he had a habit. I do not know if this was unusual for shepherds of that time, or simply his own particular way of passing the long hours, of sitting beneath my branches in the shade while his sheep grazed nearby. He would sit for hours sometimes, not doing very much as far as I could observe, watching the sheep, watching the sky, sometimes making sounds that I later came to understand were singing or humming, the particular way that people occupy themselves during long periods of solitary work. I do not know his name. I do not know what happened to him ultimately, whether he lived a long life, whether he had a family, whether he is remembered by anyone, anywhere, in the way that I remember him. But I remember him, the particular quality of his presence, quiet mostly, patient in the way that people who work with animals often seem to be patient, attuned to rhythms that are slower than the rhythms of people who work indoors, or in cities, or in occupations that move at a different pace. He sat beneath me many times across what I believe was several years, and then, at some point, he stopped coming. I do not know why. People stop coming for all sorts of reasons. They move away, they take up other work, they grow old, and their work changes, or, and this was common enough in that period, that I learned not to assume any particular outcome. They simply die, the way people did, often, from illnesses or accidents, or the general hazards of a life that was, by later standards, quite precarious. I do not know what happened to my shepherd. I only know that for some years he was a regular presence beneath my branches, and then he was not. This pattern of people becoming familiar and then disappearing without my ever learning their full story has repeated many times over the centuries. It is, I have come to understand, simply the nature of my position. I am here. People come and go. I rarely learn the full arc of anyone's life, only the portion of it that happens to intersect with this hill, with my shade, with whatever brings them here. For much of my existence, the area around my hill has been crossed by a path, not a major road, but a route that local people used over generations to move between settlements. This path passes close enough to my hill that, in certain seasons when my lower branches are less full, I can see travelers on it, and in all seasons I can hear them when they pass close enough, and sometimes smell things associated with them. Wood smoke, if they are carrying torches or have recently been near a fire. The particular smells of animals, if they are traveling with horses or other livestock. Occasionally food, if they are eating as they walk. Over the centuries, I have witnessed an enormous variety of travelers on this path. Merchants carrying goods between markets. I learned eventually to recognize the particular sounds of laden pack animals, the rhythm different from animals carrying only riders. Pilgrims in certain periods, groups of people, sometimes quite large groups, moving with a particular kind of purposefulness, sometimes singing, in the way that groups of people sometimes sing when traveling together for shared purposes. Soldiers at various points, and these were always, even from a distance, recognizable by a certain quality, a kind of organized movement that was different from the more individual, scattered movement of ordinary travelers. I have seen soldiers pass this way many times over the centuries, associated with conflicts whose details I never fully understood, but whose general nature, groups of armed people moving with purpose, sometimes followed by other groups moving in the opposite direction some time later, I came to recognize as a recurring pattern. Ordinary people, simply going about their lives, visiting family in nearby villages, moving livestock, carrying messages, doing the countless small things that fill most people's days, most of the time, regardless of what larger events might be happening elsewhere. I have watched all of this for 900 years from my position on this hill. The path itself has changed over time, worn deeper in places by centuries of use, then sometimes abandoned for a while as travel patterns shifted, then sometimes used again as circumstances changed once more. But travelers, in one form or another, have passed near my hill for as long as I can remember, and I have watched them, without judgment particularly, though I have, over the centuries, developed something like preferences, ways of finding certain kinds of travelers more interesting than others, based on patterns I have observed without fully understanding their causes. There was a period, I believe, based on what I later learned from listening to people, that this was sometime in the 14th century, when something changed significantly in the area around my hill. I did not understand at the time what was happening. I only observed the effects. Fewer travelers on the path, fewer people working the fields below my hill, an overall quietness that was different from the normal quietness of, say, winter, when activity naturally decreases. This was a quietness that extended into seasons when activity should have been increasing. Eventually, I observed something more specific. A group of people, I believe a family though I am not certain, came to the area near my hill and stayed for a while in what appeared to be considerable distress. They built a small shelter of branches and other materials near the base of my hill, rather than in any of the more established dwellings nearby. Dwellings that I had noticed seemed to be empty in a way that was unusual. This family, if that is what they were, remained for some time. I observed over the following weeks that their numbers decreased. I do not know the details of what happened to them, but the pattern was consistent with illness, a member of the group becoming unable to move normally, remaining in one place for an extended period, and then, eventually, that member no longer being present, while the remaining members continued for a while, before perhaps they too followed a similar pattern. Eventually the shelter near my hill was empty. No one came to use it further. I learned much later, from listening to people over subsequent generations, occasionally referring to the bad years or the great death or similar phrases, that this period had affected very large numbers of people across very large areas, not just near my hill, but in places I had no direct knowledge of. I do not fully understand what caused this. Illness, certainly, though the specific nature of it is something I never had explained to me in terms I could fully process. What I remember most clearly is the quietness, the absence, where there had been presence, the empty dwellings, the path that for a time saw far fewer travelers than before. And then, gradually, over years, the way most changes near my hill happen gradually, things began to return to something more like the previous pattern. New people, in some cases, I could tell, from small differences in how they moved, how they spoke, that some of them were not the same families who had lived in the area before, though they occupied similar dwellings, worked similar land. The world near my hill had changed, and then, slowly, it had continued, different in some ways, similar in others, the way that continuation after disruption often is. At some point, I believe several centuries into my existence, though I cannot date this precisely, I became something more than simply a large tree on a hill. I became a meeting place. This happened gradually as far as I could tell. People had always occasionally gathered near me. The shepherd I remembered from earlier centuries had used my shade for solitary rest, but I had also, even in earlier periods, sometimes observed small groups of people meeting beneath my branches, for reasons I did not always understand. But at some point, this became more regular, more formalized, in a way I could sense even without fully understanding the human concepts involved. People would gather beneath me on particular days. I learned eventually to recognize patterns in this, certain days recurring with a regularity that suggested they corresponded to something in the human calendar, though I did not understand the calendar itself. These gatherings took various forms over the centuries, sometimes what appeared to be disputes being resolved, groups of people, sometimes quite agitated in their movements and the tones of their voices, eventually reaching some kind of resolution, after which the agitation would lessen, and people would disperse in a manner that suggested the matter, whatever it was, had been settled. Sometimes what appeared to be celebrations, larger gatherings, often including children. I had learned to recognize children by their smaller size and their particular patterns of movement, more erratic, more energetic than adults, sometimes accompanied by music, by what I understood to be dancing, by food being prepared and shared, sometimes gatherings that seemed more solemn, slower movements, sometimes what I understood to be crying, sounds that I had learned over centuries to associate with grief. I did not always understand the specific reasons for these gatherings, but I came to understand that I had become, for the people who lived in this area, a landmark of a different kind than I had been before. Not just a point of reference for navigation, but a point of reference for community, a place where significant things happened, because it was the kind of place where significant things happen, large, old, providing shade and shelter, visible from a distance, known to everyone in the area. I did not seek this role. I simply grew, as oaks grow, and became, over centuries, large enough and old enough that people began to use me in this way. But I have come to think of this role, meeting place, landmark, the point around which community gathers, as one of the more meaningful aspects of my long existence, not because I did anything to earn it, particularly, but because it connected me, in a way that simple growth did not, to the actual lives of the people who lived near me. Over the centuries, I have observed many instances of what I eventually came to understand was romantic courtship. This took various forms depending on the period and the specific people involved, but certain patterns recurred often enough that I learned to recognize them. Two people, usually though not always, a young man and a young woman. Based on patterns, I learned to associate with these categories. Meeting beneath my branches, often in the evening, often with a particular quality of attention toward each other that was different from the attention people showed in other contexts. Conversations that lasted longer than seemed strictly necessary for any practical purpose. Laughter sometimes, a particular kind of laughter, lighter than the laughter associated with other social situations. In some cases, these meetings continued over extended periods, the same two people, returning to my shade repeatedly, over weeks or months, in a pattern that suggested something developing, something building. I do not know how most of these stories ended. Some, I believe, ended in what I understood to be marriage. The two people, after a period of such meetings, beginning to appear together in other contexts, in ways that suggested their lives had become more permanently connected. Others, I suspect, did not end this way. The meetings simply stopped at some point, without any clear resolution that I could observe. Whether this represented disappointment, or simply circumstances changing, or something else entirely, I cannot say. There is one specific memory, from what I believe was several centuries ago, that has remained particularly clear to me. A young woman who came to my hill alone, regularly, for what I estimated to be about a year. She would sit beneath my branches, not for any apparent practical purpose, simply sitting, sometimes for considerable periods. After some months, a young man began to appear as well. At first, it seemed, by what might have been coincidence, both of them happening to be near my hill at similar times. But the coincidences became less coincidental over subsequent visits, until eventually it was clear that they were meeting deliberately. I observed this courtship, if that is the right word, develop over many months, the particular quality of their interactions changing over time in ways that I had learned from observing similar situations to recognize as significant. And then one evening, something happened that I have remembered specifically for centuries. The young man knelt. I had observed this gesture before, in similar contexts, and had come to understand it as significant, associated with the kind of commitment that, in human terms, precedes marriage. The young woman's reaction, I could not see her face clearly from my position, but her posture changed in a way that suggested strong emotion. And then, after a period that felt significant even from my perspective, she made a gesture, I believe a nod, though I cannot be entirely certain, that the young man appeared to receive with considerable relief, and what I understood to be joy. They remained beneath my branches for some time after this, and then they left, together, in a manner that was different from how either of them had arrived, closer together, in a way that suggested the change that had just occurred between them. I do not know what happened to these two people ultimately. I never saw them again, as far as I am aware, though it is possible they continued to live in the area and simply did not return to my hill, their lives having moved in directions that did not bring them back to this particular spot. But I remember that evening, the particular quality of it, something significant happening beneath my branches in the lives of two people whose names I never knew, whose subsequent lives I never witnessed, but whose single evening of commitment, whatever it led to, I carry still as one of my memories. There was a period, I believe from later understanding, sometime in the 17th century, when soldiers passed near my hill more frequently than usual, and in a manner that suggested something more significant than the occasional military movements I had observed in earlier periods. This was, I later understood, a period of conflict that divided the country, not against an external enemy, but a conflict among the country's own people, divided over questions I never fully understood, but that seemed to involve disagreements about how the country should be governed and by whom. I observed during this period soldiers moving in both directions along the path near my hill, sometimes what appeared to be the same group, moving one direction and then, some time later, moving the other direction in a manner that suggested retreat or repositioning, or simply the back and forth nature of conflicts that do not resolve quickly. On one occasion, and this is among the more vivid memories from this period, a small group of soldiers, perhaps a dozen, stopped near my hill for what appeared to be rest. They had been moving for some time, based on the particular quality of their movements, slower, more labored, than soldiers moving at the start of a journey typically appear. They rested beneath my branches for several hours. I observed them eating, sharing food, in the manner that groups of people share food when supplies are limited and need to be distributed carefully. I observed some of them sleeping, briefly, while others remained alert, in a pattern that suggested they were taking turns at some kind of watch. One of these soldiers, I do not know if he was particularly young by human standards, or if my perception of him as young was simply based on something in his manner, sat somewhat apart from the others. For much of the time they rested beneath my branches. He did not sleep, as far as I could tell. He simply sat, looking out, not at anything in particular that I could identify, just looking in the way that people sometimes look when their attention is directed inward, rather than at anything external. After some hours, the group continued on their way, in the direction that, based on subsequent observations over the following days, seemed to lead toward conflict rather than away from it. I do not know what happened to this group, or to the young soldier who sat apart from the others. I never saw any of them again, as far as I could identify. This is, I have come to understand, simply the nature of war, as I have observed it across various periods. Groups of people pass through, on their way towards something dangerous, and I never learn what happens to them afterward. I see only this fragment, a few hours of rest, beneath my branches, before they continue toward whatever awaits them. I have wondered sometimes about that young soldier, whether he survived whatever conflict he was moving toward, whether he returned home eventually to whatever life he had before, whether he is remembered by anyone in the way that I remember him, a few hours, sitting somewhat apart from his companions, beneath an old oak tree, on an afternoon during a war whose causes and outcomes I never fully understood. I do not know. I will never know. This is simply one of the many incomplete stories that I carry after 900 years of watching people pass through this place. Over the centuries, the landscape around my hill has changed considerably, not suddenly, but through the accumulation of countless small changes, the way most significant changes happen. The fields below my hill have been used differently at different periods. sometimes for grazing, sometimes for crops, the specific patterns shifting according to factors I observed without fully understanding, changes in what people grew, changes in how land was divided and owned, changes I could perceive only through their effects on the landscape itself. The path near my hill has, at various points, been widened or shifted slightly in its route, or, for a period I believe in more recent centuries, been replaced in part by something that moved differently than foot traffic or horse traffic, faster, with a different sound, that I eventually understood to be associated with wheeled vehicles of increasing size and speed. Buildings have appeared and disappeared and been replaced in the areas visible from my hill. I have watched structures built, used for some period, fall into disrepair and eventually be removed or simply collapse, and then sometimes new structures built in similar locations for purposes that may or may not have been similar to what came before. Through all of this, I have remained, not unchanged exactly, since I too have grown over the centuries, becoming larger, my branches extending further, my trunk widening, but changed at a different rate, a different scale than the human world around me. I think about this sometimes, the contrast between my own pace of change and the pace of change in the human world. A human life, even a long one, encompasses change that, from my perspective, happens quite quickly. A child becomes an adult, becomes an old person, within a span of time that, for me, is simply a portion of a single phase of my own existence, not even a complete season in relative terms, though of course it represents the entirety of that person's experience. And yet, across many human lifetimes, across the centuries I have existed, the cumulative changes have been enormous. The landscape I see now from my hill is recognizably related to the landscape I remember from my earliest centuries, but it is also, in countless details, completely different. This relationship between my own slow continuity and the much faster but cumulatively enormous changes in the human world around me is something I have thought about, in whatever way a tree thinks, which I acknowledge is different from how people think, for a very long time. I do not know if there is a conclusion to this thinking. It is simply something I am aware of as part of my experience of existing in this particular way, for this particular span of time. Across all the centuries I have existed, one of the most consistent patterns I have observed involves children climbing my branches. This has happened, as far as I can tell, in every period of my existence where children were present in the area, which is to say in every period, since children have always been part of human communities. The specific children change, of course, each generation different from the last, the particular individuals unknown to me beyond the brief periods when they climb among my branches. But the pattern itself, children, usually but not always in small groups, finding their way up into my lower branches, sometimes climbing quite high, sometimes simply sitting in the lower branches for extended periods. This pattern has repeated with remarkable consistency across 900 years. I do not mind this. My branches are sturdy, sturdier in most cases than the children climbing them, who occasionally fall, though I have observed that falls from my lower branches rarely result in serious harm, the height being generally manageable and the ground below relatively soft. I have observed children playing games among my branches, games whose specific rules I never understood, but that involved climbing to particular points, sometimes calling out to other children, sometimes simply sitting quietly for extended periods in what appeared to be some kind of contemplative activity, though children's contemplation, as far as I have observed, tends to be considerably shorter in duration than adult contemplation. I have observed children carving things into my bark, initials sometimes or simple shapes, the kind of marks that people sometimes make on trees, perhaps as a way of recording their presence, their visit, in a more permanent form than memory alone would provide. Some of these marks remain visible even centuries later, though my bark continues to grow and change, gradually obscuring older marks, while newer ones remain clearer, creating a kind of layered record, though not one that I myself can read in the way that I imagine people might be able to read it if they examined my bark carefully enough. I think about all these children across the centuries. Most of them I never see again after whatever period of their childhood involved climbing my branches. Children grow up, their interests change, they stop climbing trees and begin doing other things, the things that adults do, but for a period, sometimes just a single afternoon, sometimes recurring over months or years. They climbed among my branches, played games I did not understand, carved marks that in some cases remain. This is, I think, one of the simpler pleasures of my long existence. Not understanding everything about the children who climb me, but simply being part of their childhood in whatever small way, for whatever period it lasts. I have weathered many storms over 900 years. Most of them I survived without significant damage. Oaks are sturdy, our roots deep and wide-spreading, our branches flexible enough to bend in strong winds without breaking, in most cases. But there was one storm, I believe, based on later understanding, sometime in the 18th century, that was different from the others, more severe. The wind stronger than anything I had experienced before, or have experienced since. I remember this storm vividly, in whatever way a tree remembers things, which I acknowledge is different from human memory, but which is, for me, a real and lasting form of recollection. The wind that night was extraordinary. I had experienced strong winds before, winds that bent my branches significantly, that stripped leaves prematurely, that occasionally broke smaller branches. This wind was different. It seemed to come from multiple directions, in rapid succession, gusts of extraordinary force, followed by brief lulls, followed by gusts from a different direction, as if the storm itself were somehow disoriented, unable to settle into a single sustained direction. I felt, and this is difficult to describe in terms that make sense outside of a tree's experience, a kind of strain throughout my structure. My roots, normally providing complete stability, were tested by forces greater than anything they had previously needed to resist. My trunk, normally rigid enough to support my branches without significant flex, bent, not dramatically but more than I was accustomed to. At one point, during the most intense part of the storm, one of my largest branches, a branch that had been growing for perhaps 2 centuries, by that point, substantial in its own right, broke. I do not experience pain in the way that animals do, as far as I understand pain, but the loss of that branch was significant in ways that went beyond a simple physical change. That branch had been part of my structure, part of how I distributed my weight, part of how I gathered sunlight for 2 centuries. Its sudden absence changed something about my overall balance in ways that took subsequent years to fully adjust to. The branch fell, I do not know exactly where, though based on the sounds and the change in my own structure, I believe it fell across part of the path near my hill, the path that travelers had used for centuries. The storm continued for some hours. I do not know exactly how long. Time during events like this becomes difficult to track in the normal way. Eventually it passed. The wind died down gradually, the way storms generally end, not with a sudden cessation, but with a slow diminishment, gusts becoming less frequent, less intense, until eventually what remained was simply wind of an ordinary kind, and then, eventually, relative calm. In the days that followed, I observed people, more people than usual, moving along the path in patterns that suggested they were dealing with the storm's aftermath. Some of them stopped near my hill, looking at the fallen branch, in a manner that suggested they were assessing it, whether for removal or for some use of the wood, or simply out of the kind of curiosity that significant events generate. The branch was eventually removed over a period of some days by people using tools to cut it into more manageable pieces, which were then carried away for purposes I did not know. The space where that branch had been remained, for some years, a kind of gap in my overall shape, visible, I imagine, to anyone who had known me before the storm, as a noticeable absence. Over subsequent decades, other branches grew, gradually filling some of that space, though never in exactly the same configuration as before. My shape, after that storm, was permanently different than it had been. I think about this storm sometimes as a kind of marker in my own long existence, a clear before and after, a point at which something changed that could not be undone, that I simply had to continue from, in whatever new configuration resulted. This is, I have come to think, not entirely different from certain kinds of human experience, events that change a life in ways that cannot be reversed, after which continuation happens not by returning to how things were, but by growing, gradually, into whatever new shape the changed circumstances allow. In what I understand to be more recent centuries, though recent for me still means a considerable span of time, there was a period when conflict affected the area around my hill in ways different from the earlier conflicts I remembered. I observed during this period changes in the landscape that were different from the gradual changes I was accustomed to, more rapid changes in some cases, structures appearing more quickly than the gradual construction I had observed in earlier periods, using materials and methods that produced different sounds, different visual patterns than the building I remembered from earlier centuries. I observed also a period when the sky itself seemed different. At certain times, sounds from the sky that I had never experienced before in earlier centuries. Not the sounds of birds which I had always known, but something else, louder, more mechanical, associated with shapes that moved across the sky in ways no bird moves, faster, in straighter lines, sometimes in groups that maintained precise formations. I did not fully understand what these things were in any detailed sense, but I understood, from the overall pattern, the changes in the landscape, the unusual sounds, a general quality of tension that I observed in the people who passed near my hill during this period, that something significant was happening on a scale larger than anything in my previous experience. even accounting for the various conflicts I had observed across the centuries. During this period, I observed on several occasions people gathering near my hill in ways that seemed different from the gatherings I remembered from earlier centuries. Sometimes what appeared to be official gatherings, people in matching clothing, moving in coordinated ways, sometimes accompanied by vehicles of the kind I had begun observing in more recent periods. On one occasion, I observed what I understood to be some kind of ceremony. A relatively small group of people gathered near my hill, with one person speaking for an extended period, while the others remained quiet, in a manner that suggested some kind of significance to the occasion, similar in quality to the solemn gatherings I had observed in earlier centuries, though the specific form was different. I did not understand the details of this ceremony, but I understood from its quality, the stillness of the gathered people, certain sounds that I had learned over centuries to associate with grief, that it was connected in some way to loss, to the kind of loss that the larger conflict of that period was producing on a scale I could perceive only through its effects on the people who passed near my hill. This period, like the earlier conflicts I remembered, eventually passed. The unusual sounds from the sky became less frequent and then stopped. The landscape, after some years, settled into new patterns, different from before this period, but settled in the way that landscapes do settle, eventually, after periods of more rapid change. I do not have a complete understanding of this period, what caused it, what it meant, on the scale that I understand human conflicts mean things to the people involved. I have only my fragmentary observations, the changed sounds, the changed landscape, the ceremony I witnessed, the general sense of something significant having occurred, on a scale larger than my hill, larger than the area I can observe, extending into a wider world that I know exists, but that I have never directly experienced beyond what reaches me here. In what I understand to be the present time, though present for me is simply the most recent portion of a very long continuity, the area around my hill is different from any previous period I remember in certain specific ways, while remaining recognizable in other ways across the centuries. The path near my hill has been replaced for the most part by something wider, with a surface unlike anything from earlier centuries, smooth in a way that produces different sounds when vehicles move across it, sounds I have become accustomed to over recent decades, though they remain different from anything in my earlier memory. The fields below my hill are still used for agriculture, in patterns that are recognizable as related to the patterns I remember from much earlier period, though the specific methods, the machinery involved, are different from anything in my earlier experience. People still visit my hill, though less frequently, I have noticed, than in some earlier periods, when I served more actively as a meeting place, a landmark for community gatherings. The visitors I do receive in recent times often seem to be visiting specifically because of my age. Because I have gathered from fragments of conversation, recognized as old, as significant, because of how long I have existed, in a way that is somewhat different from how I was regarded in earlier periods, when my age was simply a fact about me, rather than something that made me notable in itself. Some of these recent visitors take what I understand to be photographs, a way of recording an image that is different from the carvings children used to make in my bark, though perhaps serving a somewhat similar purpose. a way of capturing a moment, a presence, in a form that can be kept, referred to later, shared with others who were not present. I do not mind this attention. I have, after all, existed for 900 years, regardless of whether anyone takes photographs of me or not. The attention does not change what I am or what I have experienced, but I notice it, this shift in recent times toward being regarded as old, as historical, in a way that adds a kind of significance beyond simple presence. I think sometimes about what this means for my future. I am old by the standards of oaks, though oaks can live for many centuries beyond 900 years, in the right conditions, so I do not consider myself necessarily near the end of my existence, but I am aware, in whatever way a tree is aware of such things, that my existence will eventually end, that at some point, perhaps soon, by my own scale of time, perhaps not for centuries more, I will cease to continue, in whatever way trees cease to continue, through age or disease, or some event like the storm I remember from centuries ago, but more severe. I do not know when this will happen. I do not think about it constantly. Much of my existence even now continues to be occupied by the simple ongoing processes of being a tree, growing when conditions allow, resting during dormant seasons, responding to weather, to seasons, to the countless small adjustments that being alive, in whatever way a tree is alive, requires. But I am aware of it, and I think sometimes about what will remain after I am gone. The marks in my bark, perhaps, though bark does not last, after a tree dies, in the way that the tree itself, while alive, can carry such marks for centuries. The memories of people who visited me in recent times, though these memories too will fade, as the people themselves age and eventually are no longer present to remember. Perhaps in some form simply this, that I existed, that for 900 years, more or less, I stood on this hill, and people passed near me, and some of them paused for some period in my shade, and that this happened was real, regardless of whether any specific record of it persists beyond my own existence. This thought, I find, is not a troubling one. It is simply true. A fact about existence, for trees, and I suspect for people as well, though people seem to think about it differently, with more apparent concern than I find myself experiencing. Tonight, as I have on countless nights across 9 centuries, I stand on my hill beneath the stars. The stars themselves are unchanged, or unchanged enough over the span of my existence that I do not perceive any difference. The same patterns, more or less, that I have observed for 900 years, moving through their seasonal positions with the same regularity they have always shown. The landscape around me is quiet tonight. No travelers on the road nearby, or none that I can perceive at this hour. No sounds of human activity, beyond very distant and faint sounds that I have learned in recent decades to associate with the wider human world, sounds that exist more or less continuously now, in a way that earlier centuries did not have, a kind of background presence of human activity that never fully stops, even at night, even in relatively quiet rural areas like the one around my hill. I stand, as I always stand, simply existing. My roots extend into the soil below me, drawing up what they need in the slow, continuous process that has sustained me for centuries. My branches extend into the air above and around me, bare at this time of year. I am in the present season in my dormant phase, conserving what I have stored, waiting for the cycle to turn again toward growth. This dormancy is, in its way, a kind of rest, not sleep exactly in the way that animals sleep, but a related state, a slowing, a conservation of energy and resources in preparation for renewed activity when conditions allow. I have experienced this dormancy more than 900 times, each time, in some sense, similar, the same basic process, the same general experience, and each time also slightly different. This year's dormancy occurring in a slightly different body than last year's, a body that has grown, however slightly, in the time since, that carries the accumulated effects of 900 years of growth and change, and the occasional significant event, like the storm I remember from centuries ago. Tonight, in this dormancy, beneath these familiar stars, I simply exist. I do not have plans in the way that people have plans, no anticipation of tomorrow that involves intention, decision, the kind of forward-looking thought that characterizes human experience. I simply continue, as I have continued for 900 years, as I will continue for however much longer my existence extends. The night is calm, the stars are bright, and I stand, as I have stood for 9 centuries, on this hill, beneath this sky, present for whatever comes next, though I do not know what that will be, any more than I knew 900 years ago what the following centuries would bring. I have told you some of what I remember. Not everything. 900 years contains far more than could be told in a single night, even a long one. Far more than I myself could recall in full, even if I tried. But some fragments, some pieces, a shepherd, centuries ago, sitting in my shade, travelers of many kinds, passing on the road nearby, a difficult period when illness emptied the area around me of much of its population, before life gradually returned. Gatherings of various kinds, beneath my branches, disputes resolved, celebrations held, griefs shared, a courtship centuries ago that I happened to witness, though I never learned how it ended. Soldiers at various points moving toward conflicts whose causes and outcomes I never fully understood. A storm that changed my shape permanently. More recent changes to the landscape, to how people regard me, to the wider world that I perceive only in fragments. All of this, and much more that I have not told tonight, exists within my long continuity. Layers accumulated over centuries, the way growth accumulates in a tree's structure, each year's growth becoming part of the tree, indistinguishable, eventually, from earlier years' growth, except in the patterns that careful examination might reveal. I am still here, still standing on this hill, still experiencing the seasons, the weather, the occasional visitors, the ongoing continuity of simply existing in this place, in this form, for as long as my existence continues. I do not know what the coming centuries will bring, any more than I knew 900 years ago what would unfold in the centuries since. But I will be here for whatever comes, as I have been here for everything that has already happened. Let your own breathing slow now, all the way down. Feel the weight of your body settled and still, like roots extending into soil, drawing up what is needed, providing stability and connection to something larger and older than any single moment. You do not need to remember everything tonight. You do not need to understand everything that has happened, or everything that will happen. You can simply be present for this moment, the way a tree is present for each moment of its long existence, without needing the moment to mean anything beyond itself. In and out, in and out. The stars are the same stars that have always shone. The night is the same kind of night that has occurred, in essentially the same form, for as long as nights have existed. And somewhere on a hill in the English countryside, an old oak stands in darkness, roots deep in ancient soil, branches reaching toward a sky it has watched for 900 years, quiet, patient, simply continuing, as you too can simply continue into sleep, into rest, into whatever comes next, without needing to know in advance what that will be. Down and down, into the deep, quiet sleep of something that has existed for a very long time and will continue to exist for a very long time more. Sleep well, traveler. The old oak is still standing, and it will be there tomorrow, and for many tomorrows after that.